Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest episode of Industrial Insights Podcast. I have Janet Ydavoy with us of 910 Advisors, and I've worked with their team with the same client, and so thankful for them to help provide more horsepower when it comes to the supply chain analysis that's needed for these big companies. So, Janet, welcome to the show. Appreciate you spending time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And maybe you can give us a little background, where you came from, some of the places that you've worked and things that you've worked on that brought you to where you are today.
Absolutely. Well, I'm currently a senior consultant with 910 Advisors. I have about 35 years experience in supply chain, everything from demand to delivery. I'm also a licensed customs broker, so that gives me a little bit of a unique skill set where I'm very comfortable navigating through international trade and customs law and applying that to supply chain solutions and contributing to margin.
Yes, and big companies usually have global supply chains, so I'm sure that's a skill set that you can utilize and help people out more with, for sure. And then as far as supply chain goes for work that you do for companies, what are like the primary problems people are having where you help them?
Most of the problems in supply chain, we take the approach where we just break it down to something as fundamental as we can and baseline it. A lot of times it's navigating origin to destination and all of the inputs and outputs and everything else in between. A lot of times it's going back to the good old critical path calendar. And especially as companies grow and they go from fledgling to a little more mature, and as the founders move out of their entrepreneurial role into more of a leadership role, we find that that's where the different sectors of the company need to align back together again. So again, one calendar, one version of the truth. A lot of times it's a baseline solution.
I am working with a very large company that is scaling, super successful. They just brought on some private equity, and we're going from founder-led to bringing in all sorts of people and processes. And it is like I'm literally in the middle of this process. So if you had talked with me 6 months ago, I may gloss over when you say that. Now I'm like, oh my God, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, yeah, you get like a consensus and you get people that like aren't used to working together, much less setting the direction and having all the processes in place. I feel like that's a huge gap in the maturation process.
It's interesting because the founder is the architect of the company, not necessarily the engineer and definitely not the pilot. And keeping that in mind as the architect has to develop and start to always look towards the future and future-proof the company.
Yeah. So some of the ways we help, right? One of the examples we went over together was in the supply chain design and optimization and helping companies think through 3PL's and then thinking through their coverage across the country. The first time I looked at all of the inputs that go into LlamaSoft and Supply Chain Guru, there were so many of them that your brain instantly explodes. And so I can definitely resonate with the simplicity and the baseline, and you only add in what are the most important aspects to someone's supply chain. So what would be the first couple places you would start of a data sources you would look for people?
For 3PL, we would start with the origin and look at it from a global perspective, and then bring the lens down into, again, origin to destination. So, of course, the final distribution to the consumer. So all of the inputs, all of the variables, including international transportation, port of entry, inland transit, where the optimal location would be for a 3PL, and then distribution to the consumer. And kind of factoring into that almost on a three-dimensional level would be always looking at cost, time, and resources.
And you work with just as many 3PLs as you do like a consumer goods and like companies that are non 3PLs that are like larger corporates?
Yes, yes, definitely. And there seems to be more of a trend towards 3PLs and outsourcing that pillar of the company.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. To 3PL or not, or when to, or how do I get out of it and have my own locations? I feel like those are never-ending questions we hear when we're asking people, do you need more warehouse space? Are you ready to increase your distribution center count or your footprint? And I feel like so often the first place people go is 3PLs as a band-aid or as a test or as a way to like see where they should be before making like a larger commitments.
There needs to be a synergy. It needs to be like any fundamental relationship. The goals have to be aligned, and not just in the form of infrastructure, but as far as the business model and managing the business models together. So it makes sense to outsource, and especially if you're as a lot of companies are moving towards global distribution. So global inputs and global outputs, even thinking offshore 3PL.
Yep. Can you expand upon that more? That's more of getting from the origin and how you get like either raw materials or your initial product like to the ship in the first place.
There is a trend towards 3PLs close to home, Mexico and Canada, where goods could ship to, it's called the de minimis rule, and goods could ship direct to the consumer duty free, setting up 3PLs either in Canada, Mexico, or the more aggressive would be 3PL at origin. But that's, that the 3PL would no longer be 3PL, it would have to be a center of excellence where it could handle would have the resources and handle all of the infrastructure because it would be arm's length from the U.S. company.
Yeah. How would you describe the state of the 3PL community these days of like the size, the common challenges, like main takeaways for corporates?
I guess to think global and take all of the inputs, all of the data points into consideration. And what I mean by that is not only the origin, but looking at the port of entry and always balancing the cost with transit time to
Yeah, cost and transit time is the further you get away, the more important that is, or the larger the ramifications.
right, right.
I interviewed the CFO for GXO and XPO Logistics, and he's so great. We had a great conversation, and then it was amazing to see how much capital they're pouring into warehouse automation and to see like at the scale of their business and like operating at a very high level. And it was fascinating to learn more about that. And I was really impressed to see like you hear about warehouse automation and you see it, but like with their locations, like they're really putting their money where their mouth is and like trying to make that like advantage, like a competitive advantage for them where they've like adapted and evolved and invested more so than other 3PLs. Super. Okay. And then when people start going from 1 to 2 to 3 locations within the US, what are some common like issues that they go through?
Yeah, that's where it all needs to balance out. The one big factor would be inventory management, but beyond that, how to have the right goods in the right place at the right time. And so it's inventory management on steroids.
Yeah, that's a never-ending problem. And how do people go wrong, or how do you help sort them out when it comes to inventory and like that's more insight using data maybe they're not analyzing, or that's helping them like a forecast further in the future, or helping them like weigh different decisions?
If they have different product sectors and they're a lot of times they'll look at one product, say they have the major product and then they have some accessories or some other sub product category. A lot of times there isn't a good balance between everyone goes for the easy answer, and that would be to split up the accessories from the main product. But that's
Okay.
not always the answer, because there's the input that would come from the consumer, and the demand from the consumer has to factor into that. So that may not be the best way to manage it anymore. And we've seen a lot of problems with that.
And I'm sure people's inventory SKUs change over time and their mix changes over time and it can get out of whack. And
And
then
demand
when it's,
changes.
yeah,
So when and then of course there's always trends. So there's marketing trends for certain items, and it's a matter of managing all of that and not over inventorying or under inventorying, keeping that balance.
so companies, they do that internally, right? They have people, that's their job. And then it's when they have a problem or it's right before they're about to make a huge decision is usually when they come to you with their inventory issues.
Or if they're looking to expand, or they're looking to view their business from more of a global lens and start to see the global picture, where a lot of companies have regions. There's the Western Hemisphere, Asia, and Europe. And how do you merge those three together and still meet a global demand?
Yeah, that's next level. I'm not looking on that large. I haven't zoomed out that far yet, Janet. Yeah, I can only imagine different countries and different regulations and security and the million additional things you need to take into account.
And again, coming down to having the right item in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yeah, now and every quarter or in the future. For inventory, that will be something then you can model. Just like everything else, all comes back down to what can you do with that information and how do you help them? It all comes down to can you model it correctly? And then can you gather accurate assumptions to then play out scenarios? Maybe you can go through that a little bit of how you might take someone's issue and then come up with solutions for them or yeah.
And as we saw when we were working together with you on the last project, it's a matter of presenting 2 to 3 options, and then of course weighing those options with the benefits and doing the cost benefit analysis for each of those and presenting it that way, but also to look at it in terms of, as you said, like scenario planning, and do some type of a stress test to make sure that we're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's and not missing anything. There's certain ports that have more benefits than others. Inland transit could be prohibitive or cost prohibitive in some cases. So it's a matter of getting it and putting it in the right place to get it back out.
Yeah. Can you give me an example where inland transportation would be cost prohibitive?
In my home state of Florida,
Okay.
we're a peninsula. We're surrounded on all 3 sides by water.
Okay.
One way in, one way out.
That's the 75 or what's the
75.
yeah. So
So,
that's one where a routing is just not optimal.
and then there's ports that have more tax incentives and benefits than others. So those would be more desirable.
And that would be the cost of business being cheaper to route your ships there and route your shipments through it, or incentives, or what kind of breaks would you ordinarily get, like a volume?
Yes, if there's a tax break, or if it would be an optimal location for a distribution center close to the port. If that works out, that would be another consideration.
Yeah. I always get a similar question that I generally don't have a good answer for because the answer usually is it depends, which is one of the great answers out there for people asking general questions. And it's where the proverbial line is in the U.S. where goods, it makes more sense to go into a West Coast port versus an East Coast port. Usually I get that from people that have a significant investment in one area and they're just trying to figure out how to market that. And how do you look at that?
Yeah, that's definitely a variable in there. Right now, what we would consider would be the state of the labor strikes and
Yeah.
how that's impacted. So there's current events that impact in choosing one port over another. LA seems to have quieted down a little bit, but the East Coast seems to be in turmoil as far as labor strikes and relying on efficiencies in moving goods.
Yeah.
And then there's always the Midwest, which makes a lot of sense, but then it's a matter of where the goods are coming from, how they're routing internationally, where the port of entry is, and what the inland transit looks like getting it to the Midwest DC.
Yeah. And what are the most common routes?
East Coast, West Coast, East Coast, West Coast, and then of course either by truck or rail to a distribution center.
Yeah, I was looking at a couple different reports and just going through some of the deliverables of as you're looking through to 3PL or to not, and then comparing one location to another. And so common variables are real estate, transportation. Do you factor labor in there, or how does the labor equation factor into these analysis?
Interesting. Yes, we do. We definitely factor in labor, but labor's kind of there's a mid-range there, but absolutely.
Yeah, those are kind of the main things I have just thinking through studies that you guys where you help people when they're coming up with their supply chain issues. What haven't I asked, or what are other issues other than to 3PL or not, where to be within the country? I could think of a technology as maybe a Roberts, where people are implementing new technology solutions. What are other issues that are common these days?
Technology, automation, and again, you mentioned labor earlier. The one thing that we would look at in terms of real estate is what's happening in that area with competitive distribution centers. Are there several 3PLs that and what is their occupancy, or are they just breaking ground and starting to build? They already have a contract, or they will have open space available, and then that a direct connection to labor and what the constraints might be with being able to build a labor pool. So that's where the real estate comes in.
Yeah. And how do you go about checking with all the 3PLs? I got to imagine that's a job in and of itself. We got to hire more people of certain major markets. There's a lot of players. How do you come up with who the best ones are to connect with?
Yeah, it's again, we're looking at cost, time, resources, what resources are available. There's always the ramp up time that needs to be factored in because a lot of times with the timing, the ramp up with the leases and the expiration of the leases, and then how to make the smoothest transition possible. It's very disruptive. So do you manage it where you have two DCs working at the same time until you can transition fully into one? And of course, the technology piece as well. And how well equipped are they in technology? And what are the needs?
Yeah, it's so funny. The overlapping and thinking through how to transition, I'm very familiar with, because we'll help people move from one building to another. And it is incredibly disruptive. And it's so disruptive that a common comment that I'll get from people who are in charge of these projects are how many more they'll have to do before they retire. And if this is their last one before retiring, because it's so difficult and challenging, and there's so many it's extra work upon the regular responsibilities that they have, and so it's really working overtime, and so it clearly leaves a big impact on them that they would prefer not to if they don't have to. Yeah, that is terribly difficult to juggle, and so I could see why juggling that along with when you think of modeling scenarios, that is something that is maybe less tangible or less in the model of what's it going to take to pull off this transition.
That's when Robert pulls out his Gantt chart, and we start managing it step by step and hitting each of the milestones, and then looking at any constraints or issues that come up and managing it real time live as it's happening, and then coming up with a solution immediately.
Love it. I love the project management. This is when it gets real. So you guys will help with implementation and execution, not just the upfront.
Yes.
Okay. And so when you think of some of the critical things in implementation, I got to imagine that's a months-long projects, maybe even year-long in certain occasions. And then you really have to work with a diversified team. There's so many people that are involved. And
Yeah.
so I could imagine that's why Robert's on the phone right now.
And that is definitely what's key is pulling together a diversified team and recognizing all of the pillars of the business that need to know and what and when they need to know it so that everyone is moving forward with from one milestone to the next.
Yeah. And I can see where this concept of transition or an implementation of a plan is extra work for the team, like employees for the client team, why it makes sense then to hire you guys so that it's not an undue burden on the team. Would you say 50% of people that do a network supply bring you on for the implementation, or how would you say how often is it that they can handle it versus hey, can you please help us? Or maybe even get people that have to implement and then call you after they think they could have done it on their own.
That's when we do damage control. That would be 911. We're 910. We try and get
Yeah.
you before you have to dial
Yes.
911. But yeah, I would say 50% sounds about right. Yeah, it's a matter of taking the burden off of the associates' day-to-day tasks that they need to address and being able to move it forward as painlessly as possible. So behind the scenes, we do a lot of heavy lifting, and that seems to ease the burden as well.
Yeah. So then you can help them contract with the 3PLs and
Mhm.
then all things transition set up. And I love that even the IT component and the different like management systems, like integration.
Yes.
And is that still highly fraught with issues because everybody has a different vintage of something and a different way that it communicates, or that we've gotten better?
No, no, we haven't gotten better.
Okay. That seems
No.
like some of those technology solutions, like it's not that they overpromise, but just like the integration, I feel like it's less than what's advertised.
Yeah. I don't know. It's that dichotomy between the homegrown and the off the shelf, and
Yes.
which is better. And sometimes it's a combination of the two. But the IT component needs to grow with the business, so it has to
Yep.
be something that's scalable.
Yeah. It's the one you start with isn't the one you end with. You brought up warehouse automation. Can you delve into that a little bit with me? Is that area that you're pretty familiar with? The big question. It's good to be hydrated for this one.
Warehouse automation, everything from pick to light, which is connected with inventory management. Inventory management has come a long way. There's cross-docking, which is probably the most ideal automation. And it's not really automation, but it's having a refined system in place where the goods come in and go back out. Because
A better flow of goods
the
going cross
distribution,
dock.
absolutely. The distribution it's not about holding goods, it's about allocation. And so focusing on the allocation demand and not holding the inventory in the warehouse would probably be the best answer.
Yeah, when we were doing an assignment for a company for their e-commerce, it was amazing to see how many of the new buildings are cross-dock, but then only in certain markets are they building cross-docks, and only a certain amount, and kind of only in certain size ranges. And so it is interesting to think of, if you're a developer, when do you do that and when don't you? And it takes more land for more loading and more trucks and more trailers. And like it's a less efficient use of the lot for just building like maximum square footage.
Mhm.
But it seems like it's increasingly like useful and increasingly in demand.
Yes, and better at balancing, because then looking at the cost benefit part of the equation, not holding inventory is optimal.
Yeah. I have found that some people, you go in their warehouse, and even if it's several 100,000 feet, you may see almost no automation whatsoever. And people still just like maybe not doing it the same way they've always done it, but just like less machines of some kind moving inventory When do you see people don't do that? Is that just not making the capital investment? Or I think sometimes it's like what products do you have? Not all products. Like, does it make sense to move, like, or to think about moving in a different way or investing in a solution for it?
Well, when does a distribution center go from, I guess what I was trying to say is I'm thinking about returns and
Yep.
how do you manage returns when now with the downside of direct to consumer is that returns are up as much as 50%. And how
Good.
does a distribution center go from being a cost center to a profit center?
Yep.
And how do you manage the returns, re-inventory the returns, and then reallocate them? Hopefully, if it's
Yeah.
not anything that's seasonal. So that's a huge issue. Right at around 20% was considered normal, average, and you could still, be profitable with 20% returns because it was factored in with most retailers. But when it gets up around 40 and 50%, and then there's a seasonality. So if you looked at the timeline from when the goods are shipped to the consumer has X number of days to make the decision whether or not they want to keep it or return it, and it's become a shopping habit for every consumer. So
Try not
within
to
the
partake in that, but I do see it in my household.
Yeah, we all do, and we've all become conditioned to it. So after
Yeah.
30 days, it's returned and then it's sorted and then re-inventoried and then
Yeah.
hopefully it can be resold. So yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be put under the microscope. And how do we get our arms around it?
Love how do you turn it into a profit center, right? You got to imagine with people's margin, like that's probably a huge component part of their just net margin.
Hmm.
Yeah. That is way beyond my pay grade of modeling skills. I'm happy just to get the locations on the map, the transportation to the customers, and then I'm a happy man. So trying to deal with returns, I could see where that's going to take a whole level of like a sophistication. And then to have it in the same building, or do you have so many that you need your own building for it? I got to imagine that's part of the analysis as well. You got to be on the biggest scale to have your own location for returns.
Yes, or would it become in the future, would it just become a different business model where the goods are returned to, say, a third party location and then sold off price? So, the goods never return to the original distribution center or 3PL.
You and I sell returns on eBay and split the profits with the person that sold it in the first place. So you can see like there's a business model in there for.
Totally.
I love it. I would think this is a great intro for people that are thinking about modeling and dealing with the issues in their supply chain and inventory and thinking about what to do about it and having resources out there like you and your team. I'm curious, what do you look out on the horizon? Like, what are some trends that you think are impactful that are out there? What's exciting in the future that you look out for that applies and impacts these people that you work with?
Well, I think some of the topics we already hit on, how to think and act globally. What are the emerging consumer trends that we need to be aware of, and how to streamline? I think there's a lot that will impact the overall supply chain in the future, and streamlining everything from manufacturing all the way through to distribution and then to the ultimate consumer.
We can do better there. There's plenty of improvements all along the chain. I feel like with technology, the integration part's got to improve too, and that should help communication be faster and be clearer and lead to less inventory at the end of the day.
Yes.
And that should be a big one that's on the horizon. But
Real
maybe it's always been on the horizon, but getting a little closer.
It has, but you're right. Real true demand planning that is efficient.
Yeah. That's a big one. Janet, I appreciate you spending time with me and kind of opening up the Ask Me Anything type of session when it comes to supply chain. If people have questions, where can they reach you and your team?
Can reach us at 910 ADV. That's Alpha Delta Victory.com.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you, Janet. Look forward to catching up with you later.
Thank you so much, Justin. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.